Hello and welcome to Mama's Week Review with me, Nasim Ahmed. As always, I'm joined by my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani, to unpack the biggest stories of the week. Mouin, how are you doing? Thanks for joining us again.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Nasim, and I hope you're well too.
Fine, thank you. Thank you, and looking forward to this week's conversation. And as always, we'll be looking into the situation, the latest from Gaza, taking a specific focus on Israel's deportation of hostages in the various neighbouring countries, including Egypt. Trump allegedly saying he will want to transfer Palestinians to Syria as well as Lebanon and Jordan. These are all ideas he's throwing out there. So I want to look at that as well. There's a story about US contractors, mercenaries, manning Israeli checkpoints, in the Gaza Strip. What's the significance of that? That seems an interesting development which we need to look at. And turning attention to the West Bank, which is looking more and more like becoming the next target, the Gazification of the West Bank. So we want to look at that as well. And a number of international developments from Trump's hosting Netanyahu as the first Prime Minister to visit the US following his second term, Lebanon ceasefire extension, and controversy around the ICJ presidency, Julia Sebutinde. We'll get to that later on, but as I said, I want to begin with Gaza hostage deal. There's a lot of stories about that, but I wanted to focus specifically on one aspect of that story, which is the dozens of Palestinian hostages who have been deported to Egypt, Qatar as well, and Turkey, though the numbers are quite limited to those countries. One of the Palestinian officials say that they have been moved from prison in the West Bank, Israeli prison, to the Egyptian prison. That's how he described the situation of the Palestinian hostages who have been deported. So the question I want to ask you is this another form of forced displacement of Palestinians, especially if the hostages did not agree to a deal where they will be returned to a third country? I'm assuming under international law, hostages should be returned back to their country, to their home, and not to a third country, especially if they have not agreed to being bartered in that way.
It's difficult to tell because I'm unaware of the details of this agreement. I don't know if you've seen them. What I presume is that the Israelis insisted that for a certain number of Palestinian detainees in the Israeli prison system, those who had been given, for example, multiple life sentences, it would agree to release them only if they accepted to be deported. What's unclear is whether the Israelis went to these prisoners and said, you have a choice. We either expel you to Egypt or you spend the rest of your life rotting in solitary confinement, or whether this agreement was made between Israel and Hamas without the knowledge and consent of the Palestinian prisoners. I suspect that the Palestinians were given a choice. This is hardly the first time Israel does this. For example, in the 1990s, there was the case of Ahmad al-Sabah, who was accused by Israel of being a local leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. In the West Bank, he was placed under multiple administrative detention terms. In other words, he was held for a very long time without charge or trial. He had been accepted to a university in the Netherlands, and when the pressure became too much for Israel, it basically accepted to release him, provided that he would commit to not returning to Palestine for 3 years. And that, of course, has now turned into 30 years and counting. Similarly, in 2011, in the exchange of captives between Israel and the Palestinians, known as the Gilad Shalit deal, a number of Palestinian detainees from the West Bank who were released had to commit to going to the Gaza Strip instead of back to their homes in the West Bank. And I think what we're seeing now is something similar, where in all likelihood, the agreement that was reached was that if the individuals gave their consent, they would be deported to Egypt rather than permitted to return to their homes, and had to accept to remain abroad for a period probably of at least 3 or more years. I'm not aware that it's a permanent exile. The risk here, in this case, they're going to Egypt, which is a neighboring country, which is an Arab country, and so on. The risk is, if you look, for example, in 2002, with the Israeli siege of the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, around 24 Palestinian militants, if I remember correctly, were thereafter deported with their consent to various European Union countries in order to resolve that crisis. And they've basically been rotting in the streets of Europe. No one even knows who they are anymore, where they are, what's happened to them. No one cares for them. A really enormously tragic situation that is really worth the efforts of a reporter or two to look into what happened to these people, how they were abandoned, not only by the countries that accepted to receive them, but also by the leadership that negotiated this agreement. In other words, how they were abandoned by their own leadership. So it's very concerning anytime that a Palestinian, whether with their consent or without it, is deported from their homeland, because it's a violation of international law. I mean, there are certain rights that individuals cannot be compelled to renounce. In other words, even if they accept to be deported in order to get out of this horrible Israeli prison system that we've been hearing so much about in recent weeks, that does not somehow make it legitimate to deport them.
Thanks for that. Background. I really appreciate that. That's part of the reason why I asked you, because we know a number of Palestinian detainees who have been forced to a third country. Their fate is pretty much unknown. Many of them, as you mentioned, the life is one of exile and statelessness. And we know under modern international system, if you're stateless, you don't have any rights. Pretty much to have rights, you have to have a state. That's pretty much how it goes these days. And the other reason for me asking that question is because this seems to be part of a much broader pattern where Palestinians are being either expelled, or Israel seeking every opportunity it can to expel the Palestinians, and also to prevent Palestinians from returning. And that's the second part I want to ask you about, because there are something like 150,000 Palestinians from Gaza who are stranded in Egypt, and Israel is not allowing them to return back to Gaza. They are waiting in the Rafah border crossing, which Israel burnt down in 2024. So again, isn't that another sign that these are small incremental steps Israel's taking for a much bigger phase in the intensification of the ethnic cleansing policy, which we will speak about later on when it comes to the West Bank, when it comes to what Trump is saying about what his plans for Gaza?
Yes, Israel is seizing opportunities as they present themselves, and this is how it's generally worked. Where there's a war and an opportunity for mass expulsion, as you had in 1948, of course, to a lesser extent in 1967, and to some extent in 1956, it seizes the opportunity to conduct mass expulsion, where there are other opportunities, like we've just been discussing. And here we're talking about people that I think Israel views as community leaders, as political leaders, as military leaders, its preference is to have them expelled, deported to distant shores. Failing that, to at least prevent them from going back to their communities and potentially either assuming their former roles or helping a new generation to assume those roles. So if you can get West Bank activists to accept being exiled to the Gaza Strip rather than returning to Bethlehem or Jenin or whatever, that is by Israel viewed as an achievement. And as you mentioned, it's estimated that 150,000 Palestinians, perhaps more, have managed to leave the Gaza Strip, almost or overwhelmingly to Egypt since October of 2023. And Israel's priority now is as a first step to prevent these people from returning through the Rafah border crossing that is supposed to reopen this week. In other words, it's kind of the opposite of a trap. It's a one-way. It's a one-way crossing where you're permitted to leave, but you can't come in.
Exactly, and Israeli sources. I mean, a lot of this is based on what is being reported in Israel. And I think they speak about ethnic cleansing in a way which Western media is very fearful of doing. And they're quite frank and candid, openly saying and speaking about the intention of ethnic cleansing Gaza. So a lot of what I'm saying is based on Israeli sources. And one of the sources that in Washington, Trump. We've been speaking about Biden for all these years. Biden's still in my head. Trump is now considering.
We can put that one to rest.
Yeah, we can put that to rest. So, relocating Palestinians in Gaza to Syria, and the reasoning behind that is that Syria is a big country and there's lots of space, and the current government is very weak, and that may, present a strong possibility of forcing the current government to accept Palestinians from Gaza being deported there. So that again is another indication of what Trump is thinking.
Well, in the 50s and 60s, there used to be similar proposals with respect to Libya, with respect to the Anbar province of Iraq, with respect to the Persian Gulf states. And the whole idea is that somehow, if you offer these people a better life far away than they have where they are, and now I guess the choice is survival abroad rather than a slow and certain death at home, that Palestinians will somehow jump at the opportunity because Israel views them essentially as squatters. These are not people who, unlike Jews from Lithuania or Brooklyn or Odessa, Palestinians do not really have any ties to the land where they've been living for many, many generations. And the idea is that they can be enticed or compelled to leave. And of course, Israel doesn't call this expulsion because it doesn't sound very nice. It calls it transfer. And now you have neo-fascists like Smotrich and Ben Gvir referring to voluntary transfer. And what they mean by voluntary transfer is, I hold a gun to your head. I tell you what you're expected to do, or else you'll receive a bullet in the brain. And if you do what I tell you, then you're behaving voluntarily. You're not being forced to do anything. And so they've looked at this genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip as a golden opportunity to implement, again, what they call the voluntary transfer of Palestinians to Sinai. And now they're talking about Syria, and they've gotten Trump on board with this. I don't know if you want to discuss that now or whether you want to return to it.
Let's leave that for now and just finish off with Gaza. One of the other key developments in Gaza from last week is images and pictures of American mercenaries manning the corridor, the Netzarim corridor. That, of course, raises a number of questions, one being the legality of American mercenaries being deployed in Gaza. And also, is this Trump's way of providing Israel what it wants without committing American troops? So how should we look at this new development in Gaza, where there are American U.S. mercenaries in the Netzarim corridor?
Well, here, unfortunately, again, I need to plead a measure of ignorance, and I'll explain why. What we do know is that at the beginning of this Israeli-Palestinian agreement, Israel opened what's called the Rashid Road, basically the coastal road, to allow Palestinians from the south and the center regions of the Gaza Strip to return to the northern Gaza Strip. Rashid Road was, according to the agreement, accessible only for pedestrians. In other words, vehicular traffic was prohibited on the Rashid Road. More recently, with the Israeli partial withdrawal from what it calls an Netzarim corridor, that corridor within the Gaza Strip that it had occupied in order to bisect the Gaza Strip, the other main north-south road in the Gaza Strip, known as the Salah ad-Din Road, has been opened, and the Salah ad-Din Road is open only to vehicular traffic. The Israelis insisted that inspections of every vehicle going from south of the Netzarim corridor to the north of the Gaza Strip, they insisted that every vehicle be inspected. Hamas insisted that any such inspections not be conducted by Israelis. It categorically refused that for obvious reasons. And they then agreed that the United States would carry out those inspections. And as you mentioned, the United States, rather than sending its own troops, has hired these contractors who man the checkpoint and conduct what are called electronic inspections of the car, which, if I understand correctly, does not involve physical inspections or physical contact with the vehicles or their passengers. But it's quite clear, it serves the purpose of the Palestinians in the sense that Israel is prohibited from conducting this task itself. And it, of course, also serves the Israeli purpose in the sense that it is now deploying Americans to exercise a measure of control over Palestinians on its behalf.
Let's turn our attention to the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, where we are seeing increasingly large number of attacks, and people are describing the situation in the West Bank as a kind of a Gazification of the territory. So Israel carried out several explosions in the Jenin refugee camp last week, destroying as many as 20 homes. And the Israeli Knesset also approved a draft law allowing settlers to purchase Palestinian land. Again, the idea being that this is all Israeli territory, and it's actually discriminatory not to allow Israelis to purchase land while allowing Arabs to purchase land, which seems a complete misreading of history. And I just want to get your thoughts on something that's been circulating on social media, on X in particular, because all this ties into Netanyahu's long-standing desire to ethnically cleanse the West Bank as well. So there was a quote from a British journalist, Max Hastings, overhearing Benjamin Netanyahu dreaming of a war, not dissimilar to what we've seen since 7 October 2023. And during that war, and I quote, he says, "If we get it right, we'll have the chance to get all the Arabs out. We can clear the West Bank and sort out Jerusalem." So this is an old quote, which is mentioned by Max Hastings, and this has been going around on social media. And I mentioned this within the context of what's happening in the occupied West Bank, where we are seeing the Gazification. And it seems like in the space of 15 months, we've gone from people who say accusing Israel of ethnic cleansing is anti-Semitic to now openly encouraging ethnic cleansing with glee when it comes to Israelis, and as though the option of settling Palestinians in Jordan, in Egypt, in other neighboring countries is the only option on the table. So this is how far the discussion have shifted
Yes.
from being accused of being anti-Semitic for saying Israel is committing ethnic cleansing to now saying no, this is the only option on the table. It's become quite a remarkable shift we've seen over the past 15 months.
Well, Max Hastings, who I believe is a prominent British hack, had been commissioned by the Netanyahu family to write a biography of Netanyahu's older brother, who got killed in Israel's operation in Entebbe airport in Uganda in 1976. And this was important because Netanyahu has basically constructed his entire career atop the corpse of his brother, who was turned into kind of this idol of this venerated icon, who has served Netanyahu's career so well. And as you mentioned, Hastings reveals this statement by Netanyahu that if we play our cards right, we can use this war to expel all the Palestinians from the West Bank. I believe that was in relation to the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. Netanyahu is known to have made similar statements in 1989 when the Chinese government moved against protesters who had been occupying Beijing's Tiananmen Square, saying that Israel could use kind of the intense international focus on China as cover to also conduct mass expulsions from the West Bank. And the following year, there were reportedly similar sentiments voiced with respect to clearing out the West Bank and the Gaza Strip during the Kuwait crisis and what was known as Operation Desert Storm. So I think these statements, you can look at them as statements of intent, certainly, but you know, they reveal kind of the core of Zionist ideology towards the Palestinians, of Israeli policy towards the Palestinians, that these people, by virtue of their not being Jewish, have no rights and need to make way for people who are Jewish. And any opposition to that is, by definition, anti-Semitic, because if you don't vacate land that is considered Jewish and insist on staying there and preventing Jews from Europe, from France, from Ethiopia, from India, for wherever, of replacing you, then that proves that you have an irrational hatred of Jews and that you're anti-Semitic, and that's one more reason to expel you from your home and from your land. So this new law, you know, it is illegal under international law. It's a war crime under international law to settle your own population in occupied territory. Now, Israel has inverted this and basically saying it's a war crime to prevent citizens of the occupying power from settling in the occupied territory. And by preventing Israelis from buying occupied territory, occupied Palestinian territory, well, these Israelis are Jews, and therefore this prohibition reflects an irrational hatred of Jews and is therefore, by definition, anti-Semitic. I mean, there's a complete inversion of reality on its head, this Alice in Wonderland world that we live in. And the problem with these various incidents you're describing is that, you know, the international media, they have correspondents that are fluent in Hebrew, and where they don't, they have stringers that are fluent in Hebrew. So it's not like you're revealing this information for the first time. Everyone knows about this, but Israel's stenographers don't give an accurate rendition of reality for very clear political reasons. Now, as far as the Jenin refugee camp that you refer to, as you mentioned, Israel demolished a residential block consisting of some 20 buildings. Really, we haven't seen this since Operation Defensive Shield in 2002. And these are the same kind of tactics that were used on such a widespread scale in the Gaza Strip. Why is Israel doing it? Because it can, because it knows that apart from a few fake statements of concern from London, from Brussels, from wherever, no one is going to lift a finger to try to stop Israel from what it's doing, and Israel can go its merry way. It's, when people commit crimes, typically the motivation is that they do so because they believe they can get away with it. And that's certainly the case with Israel.
And to add to that, would that not, if this law gets passed, would that not communicate to the world that Israel has formally annexed the West Bank? That's what it is basically saying. If by saying that it is illegal for Arab Palestinians to buy land in the West Bank, and this because and therefore allowing Jews from Israel, Israeli citizens, to buy land in the West Bank, you're basically saying this land belongs to us. That's a way of formalizing the annexation. Can we not draw that conclusion as well if this bill is passed?
Well, it's quite clearly intended to accelerate annexation, particularly when you open up settlement to kind of private commercial transactions. But formal annexation would require a declaration by the Israeli state that it is formally exercising sovereignty over these territories. That's something that we know is very much on Israel's agenda and has been for a number of years, and we may well see within the next year or two. But I think merely legislating the right of Israeli citizens to commit war crime, the war crime of settling illegally in illegally occupied territory, I don't think that in and of itself constitutes a formal annexation.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sure that will be one of the discussions in Washington between President Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. I think many were watching carefully to see who Trump invites as his first visit, and as is the case with US tradition, Israel's Prime Minister is going to be the first Prime Minister to visit the country. How significant is that, given that we are approaching the second phase of the ceasefire deal? I think it's not far away. And what should we be looking out for in terms of what kind of discussions they have, what decisions they reach? Because as I said, one of the things high on Trump's agenda is to formalize the annexation of the West Bank. Many are predicting that is going to be the case. It's one of the things he's reported to have pledged to his mega donor, what's her name?
Miriam Adelson.
Miriam Adelson, 100 million, I think she gave. So what should we be looking out for in this meeting between Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu in Washington?
It's a very good question. I mean, Netanyahu receiving this invitation is obviously a big deal for Netanyahu, and again allows him to project to his own constituency that, leave it to me. I know how to handle the Americans much better than my rivals, and so on. But it's also a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, as you mentioned, West Bank annexation is very high on Israel's agenda and of Netanyahu's personally, for a variety of personal and political and ideological reasons. And we have significant indications that this is something that Trump has not only committed to his donors to do, but is something he's perfectly comfortable with, and is something that a number of his key officials, think of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, his ambassador designate to Israel, Mike Huxtable, and a couple of these other characters. It's something they are enthusiastically promoting. Having said that, the visit is also potentially a two-edged sword, because one of the key issues that's going to be discussed is phase 2 of the Israeli-Hamas agreement. Phase 1 was basically a suspension of hostilities, a partial withdrawal of Israeli soldiers from parts of the Gaza Strip, and the limited Israeli-Palestinian exchange of captives. Phase 2 includes a durable ceasefire, a comprehensive Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and a finalization of the exchange of captives. And everyone and their brother knows that Netanyahu is absolutely determined not to proceed from phase 1 to phase 2, but ultimately it's not Netanyahu who will decide, it's Trump who will decide, and Israel will have to do as it's told. So the key issue to look for is, basically who is going to determine what's going to happen with the second phase of the agreement. Will it be Steve Witkoff, who appears quite interested in proceeding further, and will he persuade Trump to order Netanyahu to go forward with it? Or will it be these others who will prevail on Trump to allow Netanyahu to derail the agreement? The other key issue regarding West Bank annexation, everything you've said is correct, but there is also another factor, which is America's alliances in the Arab world. Will the Saudis, for example, or the Qataris prevail on Trump not to proceed with Israel's West Bank annexation? Or will America's key Arab client regimes basically act as if it's an issue that doesn't fundamentally concern them, and thereby create the room for this to go forward? So those are issues that we still have to see.
It is worth mentioning that in 2018, when the UAE and Israel normalized relationship, one of the 2020, given by the UAE is that they prevented Israel's annexation of the West Bank. But this has never left the table. This was always on the card. And
if I can just interrupt you, sorry to interrupt you, Nasim, but what the UAE said at the time as justification for its normalization was pure nonsense. It was pure drivel. Israel had already concluded that it was not in a position to annex West Bank territory pursuant to Kushner's Middle East plan, was known as a Trump plan, from peace to prosperity. And Israel was concerned about a potential response to any formal act of annexation from its most important trading partner, the European Union. So Israeli annexation was already off the table. And the UAE mobilizes purely as a pretext. The UAE had absolutely nothing to do with Israel not annexing West Bank territory. The situation now is fundamentally different, because Saudi Arabia has not normalized relations with Israel. And it's a reasonable assumption that if the United States endorses Israeli annexation of West Bank territory prior to concluding any agreement with Saudi Arabia, that there is not going to be a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement. So the situation today is a bit more complex.
And of course, if annexation is going to come back on the table again, and all the Arab countries have said that two-state solution is a condition, or a pathway to a Palestinian state is a condition for normalization. So we'll wait and see, what they decide to do. I don't know if they will hold out or not, but the reason for me bringing up the UAE is to basically just point out that they provided justification, but that justification did not turn out to be correct, and Israel did the complete opposite, and there's still, they still doing trade with the Israelis. But anyway, we'll have a discussion about that when we get there. But I wanted to again focus on Benjamin Netanyahu and Trump's meeting. And one of the other things they will be discussing, I'm sure, is Syria and Trump's reported claim that he wants to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, some 2,000 troops, I believe. So there's always been this tension with Trump and Netanyahu. Trump's America First agenda, which is to pull American troops out and be less engaged with the Middle East and pivot towards China. That's one of his key aims, and that's one of the aspiration of, I would say, his base. But Israel, of course, would prefer for America to remain deeply engaged with the Middle East. So I'm assuming they will have this conversation, especially given that Trump is saying he wants to withdraw American troops. I mean, how do you think this conversation will go when they have this discussion about the level of American engagement in the region, in Syria? And I also presume if Americans leave Syria, Israel will permanently occupy the territory it has annexed since I think 3-4 months now, when it moved into Syrian territory.
I mean, Israel has already annexed the illegally occupied Golan Heights in 1980, and the first Trump administration essentially recognized Israel's illegal claims of sovereignty over that territory. And in December and January of last year and January of this year, Israel occupied what was previously the UN buffer zone, separating the illegally occupied Syrian Golan Heights from the rest of Syria, and some additional territory as well. And Israel has already changed its characterization of its actions from a temporary presence to an indefinite one. And I think it's only a matter of time before it seeks to annex that territory as well. You know, another thing to know about Netanyahu is that he has an extraordinary sense of self-regard. And typically, in his meetings with American presidents, you would think that it's Netanyahu who's representing the superpower, and it's the Americans who were the proxy client states. But I suspect that if Netanyahu tries to dictate to Trump what he feels the U.S. disposition in Syria is going to be, he'll be in for a rude surprise, because we know that Trump gave an order to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria during his first term and was then blocked by the Pentagon. This time, I think the Pentagon will be in a much weaker position to prevent Trump from doing so. But as you mentioned, in exchange for that, the U.S. may well endorse an indefinite or permanent Israeli presence in these additionally occupied territories, and may even endorse an Israeli claim to annex them.
Let's turn our attention to a topic we failed to discuss last week. I had that on my mind, which was the ceasefire deal with Lebanon. Israel did not pull its troops out of Lebanon, and the ceasefire deal has now been extended to middle of February, I think 18th of February, after the deadline passed last week. So why did the initial deadline pass without Israel pulling its troops? And is there any reason to think Israel will uphold its end of the bargain now?
Well, according to the ceasefire agreement that was concluded in November of 2024, Israeli troops were obliged to fully withdraw from Lebanese territory by the 27th of January of this year, and they failed to do so. And the reason they gave for not doing so was that, according to this agreement, Lebanese army troops were supposed to fully deploy in the territory from which Israel is expected to withdraw. So on the one hand, Israel is saying, well, we can't leave because the regular Lebanese military has not deployed. But it's a little disingenuous when an important part of the reason they haven't deployed is because when they try to deploy, Israel is shooting and wounding and killing these Lebanese soldiers. I think the main loser in this equation, particularly because the U.S. has effectively endorsed a continuation of the Israeli presence and then forced the Lebanese government to accept a temporary extension of the Israeli presence in occupied Lebanese territory. I think the main loser here is not Hezbollah, but the Lebanese government. As you know, recently, the Lebanese elected a new president who appointed a new prime minister, who in both cases were seen as representatives of the rival camp of Hezbollah, of those who were opposed to Hezbollah and Iranian influence in Lebanon, and what are known as the sovereigntists. Well, they've now put in a very embarrassing and difficult position where not only have they failed to ensure a comprehensive Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory, but they have been forced by Washington to accept an extension of Israeli occupation of Lebanese territory, and in so doing, to basically have legitimized Hezbollah's characterization of itself as a resistance movement, and the only one that is not going to be cowed and intimidated by Israel. So this could, if it continues past this stage, also have domestic political repercussions within Lebanon, given the recent changes we've seen in that country.
And it seems there's a good possibility Israel will hold on to Syrian territory as well as Lebanese territory.
Yes.
Especially if Trump does want to do what he said he'll do, which is to pull US troops from the Middle East, if he does do that. Let's end with a discussion about the ICJ and this scandal that's brewing and how that will affect the incoming ICJ president, Julia Sebel-Tinda. So basically, she's been accused of plagiarism by an academic in the US, and he's gone through a whole list of examples of where she's plagiarized. And it's not just any plagiarism, it's the plagiarizing her defense of her position during the genocide trial. And in her defense, she cited a number of pro-Israeli Zionist organizations, which seems quite odd if you are making a legal judgment, a legal argument. Normally what you tend to do is issue legal principles and then build your argument based on past cases. But she was quoting from Zionist sources and she was caught out, basically, word for word quoting Zionist sources. She was caught out, and there's many examples. And I think your friend Norman Finkelstein himself has also issued a long tweet explaining all the many ways she has committed plagiarism. So, do you think now her position could become untenable? If this snowballs, this campaign against her, because she is going to be the replacement, she is going to become the ICJ president, and she's the only one to vote in support of Israel at the time. And now this explains a lot. So, what do you think her position? Do you think her position is going to be untenable?
Yeah, it's a bizarre story. So, and it actually relates to our previous discussion on Lebanon, because the newly elected Lebanese president, Joseph Aoun, appointed Nawaf Salam, Lebanon's judge at the International Court of Justice, and at the time the sitting president of the International Court of Justice, appointed him as Lebanon's prime minister. He accepted the nomination, thereby resigned from the court, and has now been replaced by his deputy, who is the Ugandan judge Julia Sebel-Tinda. The historian Zachary Foster then began revealing information that she had plagiarized significant elements, I think a total of 32%, of her dissenting opinion. Zachary Foster later corrected himself because the opinion was not in the genocide case, but it was her dissent to the court's July advisory opinion on the illegality of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem. Zachary Foster quite clearly showed that not only is there very significant plagiarism by Sebutindi, but as you know, also the plagiarism was not from some obscure textbook of international law, but by very partisan pro-Israeli apologists and websites and propagandists and so on. Norman Finkelstein, who has a new book coming out soon, in fact, a very significant portion of his book is focused on Sebutindi's conduct at the International Court of Justice. And what he has found is not only this plagiarism that very clearly confirms Zachary Foster's revelations. He has gone through her dissenting opinion line by line and found multiple cases of plagiarism, but also looking at the genocide case, came to the conclusion that her positions were even more pro-Israeli than that of the Israeli-appointed judge to that case, Aharon Barak. So there's clearly something amiss here. I mean, we know she's a pro-Israeli fanatic. We know she's a member of this bizarre Christian cult. But given the way she has developed her views, and over time, Finkelstein has come to the conclusion that this is a case of either bribery or blackmail, and that Sebutinde is in effect in thrall to a foreign power. That seems to be a much more serious charge than plagiarism, and that would appear to disqualify her from continuing to serve on the world's most important court. I'm unfamiliar with the procedures for removing a sitting judge from the court because the impression is that she's too shameless to step down in disgrace, but we'll have to see how this plays out.
What do you say to those who are quite apprehensive that when she does become the president, she'll have a massive sway and influence over the case, the ICJ genocide case against Israel? Is there a chance of that? Because I mean, it's not a case which is one of the less known ones. Everyone knows about this case, and there are massive support for this case. And just this week, there was a group of countries that came together and formed the Hague Group, again, to make sure that the ICJ and the ICC holds Israel to account. So this is a concerted effort, and many of the countries in the global south see this as a milestone, as a point in history to assert their influence and remove weaken America's sway on the international stage. So, given that's the context, do you think she will have much of a bearing and a sway in the direction of the case?
Well, it's certainly hugely important that this Hague Group, consisting of a number of states who are pledged to preserve the independence of the International Court of Justice and of the International Criminal Court, and to seek to pressure these two courts to fulfill their responsibilities and mandates and obligations. I think it's hugely important that this group has come together because quite clearly its members sensed a threat, primarily an American threat, to these courts. Regarding Sebutindi's presidency, it's unclear to me to what extent the president of the International Court of Justice is a ceremonial role and to what extent it is a substantive role. So I'm unfortunately unable to determine whether she has the powers to reorder the docket or to what extent she can influence these cases. Quite clearly, the president has more influence than the other sitting judges. But my suspicion is that she has quite limited additional powers and cannot, for example, railroad the court into now, removing this case from the docket.
Thank you, Mouin. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, joining me, Nasim Ahmed, for our weekly review. Thank you for tuning in. See you next week. Bye-bye.